Hello again. In our last two lectures, we focused on the introduction and question sections of a memorandum. In this lecture, we'll focus on the next section, the answer. As usual, we'll begin with a short definition. It might be a good time to pause the video to read it. As you can see, I've highlighted a couple of things in red. The first thing is the word rationale. This is a word you'll be hearing a lot this semester and not just in legal writing. So what does it mean? Stated simply, the definition of rationale is reasoning or reasons. Usually, when we use the word rationale, we're talking about the reasons a court gave for its decision. In this video, though, I'm talking about your reasons. In the answer section, you'll be giving your conclusion as to how you think a judge, jury, or other decision maker will resolve your case. And that conclusion is crucial, but it's also crucial to give me the reasons for the conclusion. What's the logic underpinning your conclusion? What are the hard facts upon which you relied? This is what we mean when we use the word rationale. Other than that, keep the answer short. You can usually do it in one paragraph consisting of about 1/3 to 1/2 the page. And even in complex memos, I try to limit myself to no more than 3 paragraphs. Let's take a look now at some guidelines I've developed to help my students write strong answer sections. There are 5 total guidelines, but I'm going to focus for now on only the first 2. The first part of the answer section is a 1 to 3 word sentence. There are several options for part 1. Yes, no, almost certainly not, probably, and probably not. It all depends on how certain you are about the outcome of the case. As an aside, please don't use yes probably or probably yes, as I view those phrases as internally redundant. Part 2 of the answer is a narrative sentence that directly responds to the inevitable question. Let's see some examples so we can further clarify and differentiate parts 1 and 2 of the answer section. Our first example is based on something written by Brian Garner, a well-known author in the field of legal writing. Depending on the semester, it might be something you've already seen in our workbook. Regardless, let's take a look at it now. We'll start with the question section to give ourselves context for the answer. Now that you've read the whole question section, focus on the last part of the syllogism, the inevitable question. This is the crucial bit we need as context for parts 1 and 2 of the answer. As you can see here, part 1 of the answer is true to form. It's a short, one-word sentence, simply yes. Part 2 is also true to form. It's a narrative sentence that directly responds to the inevitable question. In fact, here, Part 2 is almost a restatement of the inevitable question in answer format. You might say it's pretty matchy-matchy with the inevitable question. But that's okay. That sort of redundancy is acceptable and maybe even desirable in this part of the memorandum. Our second example comes from something you've already seen, the model memo. We'll start once again with the question to give ourselves context for the answer. Now that we've refreshed our memory as to the question, we'll focus again on the last part of the syllogism. Part 1 of the answer is true to form, a short 2-word sentence, probably not. Part 2 is also true to form, a longer narrative sentence that directly responds to the inevitable question. In this example, the inevitable question and part 2 are not as matchy-matchy as in the last example. If you prefer this style, that's fine. You can either have a lot of redundancy in this part or a little bit less so, as we see here, as long as you're directly answering the ultimate question in the memo. Let's look now at the rest of my guidelines for the answer section. Part 3 of the answer is a test, and Part 4 is a rationale. Part 5, indicated by the arrow, is optional. Sometimes it's a nice touch, but sometimes it's overkill. Just make sure, though, in the answer section that the stand you're taking, the prediction you're making about the outcome of the case is clear. Now let's take a look at a full question and a full answer and dissect each part of the latter. This example is again from the model memo, and it's covered in the workbook, so I'll go through it pretty quickly here. Take a look first at the question section. The last part of the syllogism is the question, was the act privileged? Part 1 of the answer, as you know, is a short answer. Part 2 of the answer, as you also know, is a short narrative sentence answering the question. Part 3 of the answer is a test. Now I use the word test, but don't get too tied up in that exact terminology. I'm using the word loosely. If you need to think of it as a principle or a rule or a legal framework, that's fine. Part 4 is the rationale. Again, rationale means reasons. For example, I don't just say the act was a communication. I give the hard facts underlying that conclusion. I say that Mr. Minot's act was a direct response to a question. I analogize it to an answer to that question. In addition, I don't just say this was an attorney-client relationship. I give the facts that I'm relying upon. I mention that the two had never met before. This is a bad fact for my client, Mr. Minot, but I need to include it because memos are objective. I also say that Mr. Minot needed a defense attorney, another hard fact that indicates an attorney-client relationship. And finally, I mentioned that he'd read an article about Ms. Canterbury's work, prompting him to choose her, yet another fact indicating it's an attorney-client relationship. As I said before, make sure in your answer section that you're taking a firm stand. Don't be wishy-washy. The only reason I'm being slightly contingent in my answer here is that I didn't have room to deal with all 4 elements in the answer section. The 2 I targeted were the 2 biggest and most important elements. Later in the memo, I go on to analyze all 4 factors, so in my ultimate conclusion section at the end of the memo, I can take a totally firm stand with no contingencies at all. Sometimes, especially in school, you'll do something like this because you've only been assigned, say, 2 of 4 total elements. If you do that, though, drop a footnote to let the reader know what's going on. When you're writing a memorandum, you might want to hold off on writing the answer section until you've completed the analysis and conclusion sections. The reason I say this is that I've found that the writing process is not just writing, it's also analyzing. My guess as to how the case will come out when I begin writing might have changed by the time I'm done with the memo. Regardless, if you prefer to do things in order, that's okay. Just make sure you go back and check your answer section at the very end to make sure it's still consistent with the conclusion you finally reached. With that, you're ready to try your own hand at writing an answer section. It's pretty formulaic, so if you just follow our 5-part recipe, you'll do fine. Thanks, and see you next time when we continue this conversation about memoranda writing. Our topic will be the facts section.